Okay, this morning, it's December 6th, the year 2001. I'm Dr. Dave Thompson. We're here at the Palm Springs Air Museum, and I'm going to be interviewing David Switzer. David was a PBM pilot in World War II with VPB-25 in the Philippines. So we're going to talk about that and a lot of other stuff. Nice to have you here, David.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
When and where were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, on December the 9th, 1922.
Sounds like you got a birthday coming up soon.
I'll be 79
Oh,
coming up.
well,
And I had a red letter day in golf. I just shot my age,
wow.
which pretty exciting.
Congratulations. Where were you playing?
I belong over to O'Donnell's golf.
Oh, yeah, sure.
But it's it's 2 nines.
Yes.
But it's
Oh.
listen, it's enough golf for me to enjoy.
Enough golf for anybody. 79, that's wonderful. That's great. What's been your lowest score in the past?
Well, when I was younger, I used to shoot, in the low 70s.
Did you?
But as time goes by,
Yeah.
things change.
So you were born in Brooklyn. What was your dad's name and what did he do?
His name was William, and he was a merchant. My mother was a homemaker. I have no memories of Brooklyn. We migrated to the south. I had a brother older and a sister older. My brother's name was Arthur. My sister was Rose. And the family migrated to North Carolina to a small tobacco town called Wilson. In fact, when I was there, it was called the world's largest bright leaf tobacco market. 70,000 people, mostly tobacco and farmers. And
what year did you move there?
well, we must have moved there when I was about 6 years old. Would have made it sometime in the late 20s. Because my father passed away in 1930, so we were living there then.
How old was he when he died?
Around in his 40s, very early 40s.
Did he have a heart attack or something like that? Or what?
I think he did. He was a fairly high liver.
And so you were what, about, how old were you?
I was 8 years old.
Oh, you were 8 years old.
It was 1930.
Oh, yeah. Did your mother remarry?
No. And my sister was about 18 years older than I am. So she was sort of she and her husband were sort of the foster parents, so to speak. And I went to school in high school there in Wilson, grammar school and high school.
What was the name
Small
of
town.
What was the name of the grammar school?
Well, the grammar school was Margaret Hearn, and the high school was called the Charles L. Kuhn High School. I'll have to say this about education. It really was a marvelous education. In those years, the teachers were well educated themselves. They were devoted. They were difficult. I had 6 years of Latin in school, which is very useful, because most people know that have studied it.
Sure.
And I found it to be, to have stood me in wonderful stead as far as my education. We had excellent athletics in the school. We had a wonderful coach named Leon Brogdon. Leon just died a few years ago in his late 80s. Marvelous person, individual, builder of young men, and really replaced my father. I played junior varsity and varsity on the first team for football, basketball, and tennis. Some track. I was inducted into the High School National Honor Society, and did a few other things like drama club. And so the school was really, for me, it occupied a lot of my time. Yeah. And was very, very interesting. I still have schoolmates there.
Did you do much dancing when you were in
No,
high school?
I was a young boy, and then in those days we all sort of danced. The jig bug was out, and there was a big band era was then, and of course we all used to have the dances in the warehouse, tobacco warehouses. For the most part, they were the biggest place there to hold anything.
Well, I was getting at, you said you were in drama.
Yeah, well, we did a little theater there on stage. And
any dance
no, that
numbers
was
or anything like
just one of the plays I remember was 17.
Yeah, because I know later on you
Yeah, I
got
did.
real big in a big way, so I was wondering whether...
No, there was no, except for just social activity that we had in school.
What position did you play in football, on the football team?
We had a football team in those days. We had about 18 men total that were on a team, and we played both defense and offense. We didn't get out and rest.
Yeah.
And I played wingback. We had a double wingback system. I played wingback on offense and end on defense. And we played the whole game unless you got hurt.
Oh, sure. Right.
And then in basketball, we were a small school. We only had about 500 students, including 7th grade through 12th. So it was a small school, and we were in a Class A conference, and we were playing large schools like Durham High School and Raleigh High School and Winston-Salem, and they were very large schools and, pretty good sized population to draw from for their teams. But we held on.
How tall were you?
I was probably then about 5'8" or 9". I was probably about as tall as I got. I only weighed about 135, 140 pounds.
So did you play guard or forward?
Well, no, I played in football.
You
mean in basketball? In basketball, I played forward. We had, those were the years where if anyone was 6 feet tall, they were tall.
Oh, yeah.
And I think an interesting point for us as far as we played Durham, and Durham High School had a team of players that had played together for years. They were two brothers called the Loftus brothers. I remember the name after 60 years, I guess. And they had a big tall guy by the name of Bones McKinney. He was about 6'4".
Sure, he was a good coach later on.
And he played for the University of North Carolina.
Right.
Then they had another big player by the name of Bob Gant, who was about 6'2", that played football for Duke. So they had a very big team, and they were one of the early, certainly high school teams that had fast break. Yeah. And they used to beat, the local yokel teams like us, and other teams, they'd beat 60 points was a lot of points. They beat them 60-20 or 60-15, and I think they won the National High School Basketball Championship at least 2 or 3 times, because they were just a big team. And I think our claim to fame is one year we held them to either even or 2 points at halftime, and then the ceiling fell on top of us and it clobbered us. But they were really good. They used to play Duke freshmen. They beat Duke freshmen at that time. So
because Durham is where Duke is.
Yeah. So the university is. But anyhow, the high school football got me in good shape.
Now, tell me again, Wilson is where?
It's located about 50 miles from Raleigh, in the kind of west of Raleigh, and it's right on Highway 301, the old Highway 301. It's on the left side of the road as you go through it.
I was stationed at Camp Lejeune
in
Jacksonville, so
sure.
I know the area somewhat.
Yeah.
Now, this, again, it's kind of during the Depression, about the time your dad dies and stuff. Was that really tough for you and your family?
Yeah, it was. It was very difficult. Those were all, we had plenty to wear and plenty to eat, but it was difficult since my father passed away. My sister was married, and husband had made a living, so we survived.
Did you work while you went through school?
Yes. I worked in sold newspapers like all the kids did, and I had a paper route, and I worked in stores when I could on the weekends, because I had football practice every day, or basketball practice or something, tennis every day, so it was mostly weekends that I worked, make a few dollars.
Let me ask you about how did you get into tennis? I remember when I was a kid, basketball, football, baseball, tennis, we always thought it was a sissy sport, so I never, well, actually I did. Our senior year, they started a tennis team, so they got me to play on that. And of course, I've played ever since, and it's a great sport, and I really like it. How did you get involved in it?
Well, it was interesting because the coach, we only had one coach. He coached everything, as you know. And so when basketball season was over, all the same group that played football and basketball played baseball. But I was involved because, I don't know, I used to watch tennis whenever it was available to see. You know, they'd have it sometimes in the theaters. You know, but there were no TVs, nothing else. And it was an individual sport, and I was very quick. And I guess my most interesting tennis story would be that I used to go every year to the University of North Carolina. They had the Interscholastic High School tennis team, a tennis championship for all the states for the high school teams. And I'd pack up my little racket and put it in my gear and put it in a bag and thumb my way up to Raleigh. Those days, you know, people would pick you up in the car.
Sure.
And I'd get up to Chapel Hill and check in. And about every year I'd get knocked out. He said, you know who this kid is you played? And you can believe it or not, it is about the way it was when you grew up in the South in those years.
Now, you coming from Brooklyn and your family, did you think your family had a different feeling about the blacks and the people that were down there? Have no idea.
I have no idea because it was small, and I think that the blacks were there. They had their place. Everything was, for colored only or white only, and we really just mixed with them privately. So, like as I said, with the housekeepers' children, or we played with them, or we got on a farm somewhere, we'd play with them. So there was never any real problem being around them or anything. It was just segregation, and of course at that time to marry or intermarry and those things were unheard of. So life, world changes.
Did you have a girlfriend in high school?
No, I was pooped out every night playing sports. I really didn't have a lot. There was some attractive girls in school, but I really didn't.
Now your dad, where did your ancestors come from?
I know very little, to be very honest with you, about my family, because they never said very much about their background. My father passed away. I knew very little or no relatives that we had. There were, I think, some back in New York. They were European, from either parts of Germany or Russia. Immigrants that came in, they were probably first generation immigrants. But that's about as much as I know about it. There's very little, and my mother passed away.
What was your mother's name? Her maiden name?
Ann.
Ann. A-N-N-E or A-N-N?
A-N-N.
And what was her maiden name?
What was her maiden name? I don't know.
Oh, that's all right. Did you?
I'll think of it.
Yeah,
I'll tell you.
We can do that later. Yeah. Did you go to church much when you were a kid?
Some, but we were kind of mixed.
So when you graduated from high school, what year did you graduate from high school?
1941.
1941. Okay.
41.
Yeah, 41. So what did you do after graduation?
I had thought about college. This, of course, 41 was the Pearl Harbor year, but this was June.
Before that, in June, right?
It's in June, and I had thought about college, and then.
Had you at this time? Did you have any inkling that we were going to be at war pretty soon?
We had very, very little. There was no CNN. There was nobody watching television. Newspapers didn't follow it. You would see in the in the movies, they'd always have Fox Movie Tone News or some of the news programs, and you would see what was happening. They would talk about what Japan was doing and things of this nature, but really no one ever focused very much on what was happening in the world in those days. So I didn't really, and so there was no. I did have a military experience while I was in high school. Those days in the 30s, they had what they call the civilian military training camps. I don't know if you ever remember those, but they were training camps that were held at large military installations, and Fort Bragg had one of them for the field artillery. And it was a 1 month training for high school students. Usually from about, started going there in 1938, I guess. So I went about 3 years, and you go in August for a month. And it was hot. If you were in Camp Lejeune in the summertime, you know what North Carolina is when it's hot. And of course, we were issued the World War I uniforms. We had high top boots, those big lace, 18-inch lace boots. We wore those wide brim field caps, fat hats. We had neckties. We had those big jodhpur looking pants, that fit into the boots. And we were drilled by World War I sergeants, and they were tough. I mean, they really enjoyed whipping up these young high school kids. Fortunately, I was in good shape from all the sports, but they were tough. And in those days, the first year I went, everything was horse-drawn. It wasn't mechanized until the next year. So we had to learn how to clean horses, clean the stables, and use them they used to haul the cannons and the ammunition ones. And we also had to learn to man the cannon. Otherwise, they used to use the old French 75s from World War I, and they would mount on the cannon, on the barrel, a 37 millimeter cannon that we could fire because it was cheaper, because it was a depression and they were saving money. And we used to learn the different positions, because there was whenever you have a cannon company, and they don't sit by the cannons all the time, so they're over doing something, and then all of a sudden somebody hollers, cannoneers posting about 100 miles an hour, everybody runs and jumps to where their positions are, and you get ready to fire. And so this drill and training experience and military order was excellent to me when I went into the Navy, because I already knew how to close order drill, I knew how to march, I knew how to do cadence, and so I was already a jump step ahead in military. So I had that training for 3 years, and in fact, you could get a commission out of it. Otherwise, you went 4 years and took a correspondence course, you'd be a second lieutenant, and you'd be dead in France, and you've been dead in France at 42, or 43 or something.
Yeah.
But anyhow, that was a good military experience. But going back to your question about high school and when I was leaving school, I was interested in the University of North Carolina. I was interested in journalism. I used to write a little bit and do a little poetry. But as things happen in life, I had a good friend of mine that convinced me that I should go to the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company and attend their apprentice school. They had the best, most well-known apprentice school in the country for building ships. And at that time, they were building the Essex and Bonham Richard class of carriers for the Navy. And so it's a 4-year course. It's like a college, and but you came out with a trade, and which demanded very high wages, because you learned not only shipbuilding, you learned ship design and all the different positions in ship construction. So I got tied up with that, at least for the first year, and of course they had a football team too and a basketball team, and so I played on all of those.
So it was like a college?
Yes,
what was the name of it?
It was called the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company Apprentice School in Newport News. And it was a large school with, and you went to school a half a day, and you studied design, you studied all math, and everything you did in college, and then a half a day you worked in the yard as an apprentice, but pretty soon you had helpers. And those days, I was making 75 cents an hour as an apprentice, and the helper was making $2.50 because I was in school.
Yeah.
But he was helping me.
Uh-huh.
And I was starting out as a ship fitter. And a ship fitter cuts steel with a torch. You have to learn how to weld, tack weld. That's what you do. You take a job and you'd cut the steel for it, and you'd go down in the hull, and you would put it together, tack it together with short little welds, and then a welder would come along and weld the whole thing up.
Oh.
So there were jobs that you would be sent out on, which you would learn to do to put into the to construct the ship. And of course, it's kind of scary when you get these things built when they're real high, you know, when they're skeletonized, and you're walking on top of these beams. It was for a kid that hadn't been that much out of North Carolina. It was a little scary, but very interesting work. And
Newport News is in Virginia.
Yeah, it's in Virginia. So I was in the shipyard in 1941.
What were you doing on December 7th?
Well, I don't really recall. I was probably working. If it was a work day, been working. Weekends we didn't work. And then the flying, how I got in aviation is, I don't know, it's like everything else in life I ever do. Things just come up and you do them.
You hadn't
I had never seen a plane up close or been in a plane. I'd made model airplanes as a kid, that's most kids did. We stuck them together with balsa wood with glue and wound them up with rubber bands and flew them. But never really, I used to read these. There was a magazine called G8. And G8, and I wish I could find one of them, was a story always about G8 was an American pilot flying the Sopwith Camel, British airplane, and he was always dogfighting with Red Baron, with von Richthofen flying the Polka DC-7, D7. And, but there were all these stories about that, and that probably is what interested me in flying, was reading these stories in the pulp magazine. So one day I saw there was a poster in the shipyard that said, "Be a Naval Aviation Cadet." And I said, well, that sounds pretty good. And the war was on. And I would have been deferred because they were deferring shipyard people, they need them. So they were, but I said, no, I don't worry about that. So I said, well, let me try. So I went over to Norfolk. They said, you're too young, you got to have permission from your mother. I said, all right, but I'll sign up. I get the permission. So I signed up, and they sent you up to Washington for physical, a flight physical. And I passed the physical, got the letter from mother, and went in the program on September the 11th, 1942. At that time, when we went into the program, aviation cadets were not really midshipmen in the Navy. It wasn't until December the 15th of 1942 that all the aviation cadets were converted to midshipmen, to where we wore actually Navy uniforms. That's why when I showed you the photos, we had the CPT uniforms. But my date of rank and date of everything else in the Navy was September the 11th. They credited all that time. So anyhow, I went into the program, the cadet program, and that was in September. And they called me in October to go to civilian pilot training. At that time, they had civilian pilot training. They had the Navy hired a number of civilian pilots as instructors, and they used the Piper J3 Cub for training, which was about a 40 horsepower Lycoming engine airplane, tail dragger, and not really the easiest airplane to fly, particularly if someone never flown it or seen a plane.
Where did you go?
Well, I went to Randolph-Macon College in Virginia. They had the course there, and we flew out of a little small airport in Ashland, which was 1,000 feet square, with trees all around it. It was a grass field, I'll never forget it. And I was I have to say, I was a lousy pilot almost my whole career, well, the early training career. I really was. I was not a natural pilot, and I had to work at it, but fortunately I got through it all, but I killed myself. But when I had an instructor that was from New York, and he was short-tempered, he had no patience, and every time you did something wrong, he'd hit the stick, so I'd flop around and get left. And I had a mess the first few flights I had. And finally it was time to solo. So, as fate would have it, I got we had one airplane that had about a foot slack in the left rudder. So I get this airplane, and I could only take off with them straight. And the airport was square. And you'd head into the wind best you could. So I get out there and I line this thing up into the wind, and I put the power on it, and the thing starts to turn, and I couldn't correct it, so I ended up going in this direction. And I'm running up against the trees, and instead of stopping, I pulled back on the stick. I can still remember, and I'm climbing up over the trees, and I'm staggering over the trees, and I finally get airborne. And somebody told me later that my instructor was watching in the ready room. And he stuck his head out the window and he says, turned around, he walked off, shaking his head and says, there goes another damn fool killing himself. He thought I was gone.
Yeah.
And you didn't want to see the rest of it. But anyhow, I got over there and I was so scared. I didn't know how to fly. I knew how to keep it in the air. And I circled the field, making sure I could find the place when I got back. And when I landed, and I got through that thing, and that was in December. I think it was on my birthday in '42, and I sold it. And then I got called in by the chief pilot, and I said, "This is it. They're gonna wash me out. I know it." So he was a very seasoned instructor, you know. And he looks at me and he says, "You having trouble, son?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "Well, we're going to change your flight instructor." So then I found out later all the students having trouble, he fired him. But that went on, and then I went to another advanced CPT course, and I had a Chinese instructor who was very calm, quiet, and went through pretty easily through that course.
Where was that? Same place?
That was in, it was near Rona, near the other school, but I can't remember exactly the airport. I think it was Buford Airport. But in any event, it was just a little more advanced course in it. And unfortunately, I heard later that my Chinese instructor got killed over the airport. He got a head-on with another instructor. But that was the CPT part of it. And then, and as I said, in December, we got our uniforms, and so we were actually in the Navy. That was '42. Then the next step in training is the pre-flight training, and they had schools all over the country. I lived 50 miles from Chapel Hill. They had one, but why did they send me to Athens, Georgia, to the University of Georgia? And pre-flight was, I don't know if has anyone ever talked to you? Have you ever heard anything about the naval pre-flight?
A little, but why don't you tell me a little bit about it?
Well, it was an interesting experience. The intent of it was to about three things, it looked like to me in retrospect. One, there was an academic aspect where you learned about aircraft engines, theory of flight, aerodynamics. You studied a little more math, learned theory, you know, how the airplane flies, what makes it fly, and then there was a very large sport activity. The Navy brought on board all the athletes that didn't get drafted, professional athletes, in almost every venue of sport. We had football, soccer, basketball, boxing, wrestling, judo, other hand-to-hand combat, and these instructors just reveled in blood. I mean, the more bloody it was, the better it was. And so it was, fortunately for me, I was in good shape. So that aspect of it, I managed to handle very well. Except we had platoons, and I was the biggest fella in my platoon, except for one other fella. And I had to fight him all the time. And he was a big, ugly guy, and he used to beat me up all the time. But I had another friend in another group that was a tri-state boxing champion from Virginia and the area, and unfortunately got killed later in the war. But I said to him, I said, "Red, I'm going to get this guy to fight in a smoker against you. I'm going to convince him he's good, and I want you to chop him up." So he did. I convinced this guy that was beating me up. I said, "You got to fight a smoker." I said, "Boy, you can really do it." So they put him up against Big Red, and Red just clobbered him for 3 rounds. So
What's a smoker?
A smoker was where they had a night of athletic boxing mostly, and I don't know why they call it a smoker, but it was just comes out of my mind. That's what they were called, and we would attend, and they would have fights of different weights, and this guy was a heavyweight. So it was an outlet, you know, for the cadets. So that part of the training was very physical, and as I said, some schooling, and then that's followed by primary training. Primary training was really the Navy's, and I think the Air Force's or the Army Air Corps' way of elimination of pilots. That was where the Stearmans were flown for us, or the N3Ns, N2Ss. One was made by the N3N was made by the Naval Aircraft Factory. The N2S was made by Stearman, and they look very similar, except a little bit in the tail. Both biplanes and trainers, and they open cockpit. So I was in St. Louis. I went to St. Louis, base there, and flew out of Lambert Field. That was in June, I think, of '43, and struggled through E-base. It was a struggle. I was about the same kind of bad, poor pilot, I like to say there. I made it through, but I guess the most exciting part of the whole thing was the night flying. I mean, it was, the instructors were scared to death because what happened, all the cadets we had some solo and some with instructors. And they were all in the traffic pattern at night. No lights, speak of, I mean, you couldn't see much. And there's no control, there's no radios, no nothing. So everybody's flying around and who knows going to run into each other. I mean, it was something else. Instructors hated it. I mean, that was really the bane of their existence. But we got through it again. We had a few casualties. Some people got, there were a few hit airs and things. But so after E-base, that was, of course, where you had formation. That was the beginning of formation flying. And acrobatics, we had that in there. Those were the main ones there, besides the preliminary, primary learning airplane. And then from E-base or primary, there was advanced training, generally in either Corpus Christi or Pensacola. That's were the two main basic training commands for advanced training. So I went to Pensacola. That was probably about August or September of '43. And in Pensacola, you start out with the basic trainer that we used was the SNV multi-vibrator. The Army Air Corps used it too. It was a PT-13 or something, I think I remember, but it was the same trainer. It was a manual crank, geared thing, flaps. And that was used in primary. And I was at Salt Lake Field for that at Pensacola. And then for instrument training, there was the black box, the link trainers, that we used the old link trainers. And I don't know, probably not too many people remember what the link trainer was, so I'll just speak briefly about it. Sure. It was a black box that rotated a little bit, and it had very basic instruments in it, needle ball airspeed, a little kind of a gyro horizon. And you were enclosed, so you were flying, and you had a throttle, and it was speed control. And there were, outside the link was a table with a enlisted person who was recording the data from, they had a stylus running on a map of what you were doing, and it recorded your airspeeds and heading and everything. And we did basic instrument flying in it and radio range navigation. Now, for the benefit of those who've never flown the radio range, which probably went out of use, and well, they're still being used in the 50s. So probably somewhere in the 60s when they were replaced by VOR, which was a big improvement. Then DME and TACAN came in later. But the radio range was a system of navigation, as usually they were located on or near an airport. It transmitted signals in 4 different directions, northeast, southwest, and it had quadrants that were sent out Morse code. The north, I think the northeast quadrant was an N, the southwest quadrant was an N, and then A's and A's. And they sent Morse code, that signal, it transmitted, so you heard it in the radio. So everything was done by sound, and you had a chart. It was drawn, it was a chart that had the range. And the first thing you do is you turn it on, and there was an identification of a Morse code signal that told you that was the range. Make sure you're on the right station.
So you had to learn Morse code?
Yeah, we had to learn Morse code, and send it and receive it. We had to learn, I think it was 10 words a minute. That was for later use in the airplane too. But in any event, so the Morse code for the station, each station had its own identifier. And then, once you identified the station, you would get the signal, either an N or an A signal, and that would tell you where you were, at least which quadrant you were in. And then you would fly either towards the station or away from the station. If the signal sound increased, you were flying towards the station, or decreased, you're flying away from the station. So you identified that part of it, and that told you in a way where you were in a quadrant, and then you tried to intercept one of the legs so you get to the station. And you knew you were on the leg because where the leg was, you had a null signal. The A and the N came together and there was a null. So once you intercepted the null, you would turn towards the station. And once you were over the station, then you would execute the instrument approach procedure for that station. So that was basically how radio range worked. A lot more difficult and more complicated than the other.
By the way, we do have a flight simulator, or what was it that you, the
Radio
Black Fox?
range?
No, the Black Fox.
The Link.
Trainer.
Yeah.
Down in the B-17 hangar. And we have one of our volunteers was an instructor on the Link. And so he's starting to teach
That's
guys
wonderful.
how to use it, and then when the visitors come,
That's really
you can let them get in it and see what it was really like.
That's
so you might want to
yeah, I would want to see it. It's a historical. That's really
Yeah,
a
exactly,
historical piece because the Link trained an awful lot of pilots.
So at Pensacola, that's where you...
Well, yeah, in
did that?
Pensacola, so from the primary training in the SNV, the multi-vibrator, they call it, you went to instrument flight training, and the ground part was the Link trainer. And then they used the secret Navy jet, the SNJ, or the AT-6, as we call it, as the Army call it, for instrument training under the hood. So you would fly that. You really didn't even check out an airplane. You mostly just would fly the airplane under the hood and do in-flight instruments and approaches and so forth. Then there was a period in doing that period where the student had to make a decision on a couple of things. They had to decide whether they wanted to go in the Marine Corps or stay in the Navy. You may want to go in the Marine Corps may not select you, because it depends upon, the next thing is what equipment did you want to fly in advanced training. Because your advanced training could have been in patrol boats like I was in, PBYs. It could have been in the SNJs, which were used for fighter bomber training, or it could be used for the Beechcrafts that we used, twin Beaches that they used for multi-engine training. So you made your choice, and depending upon your choice, it would depend. I think the Marine Corps, depending upon what your records were and everything else, they would decide whether they would accept you if you put in or not. Most of my friends went in the Marine Corps. They all wanted to be fighter pilots, so they all ended up flying F4Us, and half of them got killed in the Pacific. I went into the P-boats, and we used the PBY, the consolidated PBY for training. Seaplane.
That's a patrol seaplane.
That's a patrol seaplane. The PBY.
Maybe it'd be a good time to
Sure.
we'll do a little close-up on our photograph over here and let you
Well,
talk
why
about...
don't we do this,
Yeah.
if it's okay with you? Why
Sure.
don't I finish this up, and then
Yeah.
we'll do that when I get to the PBM training, which is next.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, that'd be good.
So the PBY training was done at Bronson Field, but there was a waterway there. And I'll tell you, when you go from a relatively small land plane to a big seaplane with two engines and a big long thing that's landing on water, which is an entirely different operation, it's quite a change. It was interesting, a little difficult in the beginning, but you got through it. And of course, the first thing you find out when you fly a seaplane is that the water is very soft until you hit it hard, and then it's hard. But seaplane training was good, and the PBY training.
How about taking off? Is it much different
Well,
than taking off on land?
Oh yeah, it's I'm going to cover a seaplane operation landing and takeoff very shortly. So I went through the training there, and the next step in training is operational training, and that's the same for fighters, boats, and everybody else. So depending upon what aircraft you went to a different base. The operational training at that time were in PBNs, at Banana River, Florida, which was Cape Kennedy, Cape Canaveral, all that area down there. But it was called Banana River then. There was a Naval Air Station there that was a PBM training base. In fact, what I had mentioned earlier to you about simulators, the first flight simulator of any kind that I know of was created for the Navy by a Captain Louis Flores, who was the chief of in the Bureau of Aeronautics of the Special Devices Division. And he got advice from Charles Lindbergh and Einstein on how to duplicate as well as possible the control forces in an aircraft and to construct a simulator. And he worked with Bell Laboratories, and using the highly skilled people that he could, they created a PBM simulator in October 1942, a prototype, and it was delivered in November to NAS Banana River for PBM training. And they got it in March of 1944, which I think was just about after I left. I'm not quite sure because I was there in February of 44, it's about 1 month. So it was the first simulator. In fact, Captain Flores received the Collier Trophy from the National Aeronautic Association for his invention of that device, and it was extremely high praise for its use. So anyhow, in Banana River, we were flying this aircraft, the PBM. Now, the PBM, there were many, many versions of the PBM. It was originally, construction was it's made by Martin Aircraft Company in Baltimore. And Glenn Martin was a very famous early pilot. And he moved his plant to Baltimore. And because he was interested in seaplanes. And he had built the China Clippers, the Martins, the early ones, the ones that they were flying. Because Boeing they had some Pan Am and Boeings too. Martin in '39 they started construction on the seaplane, and they built the prototype. And one of the reasons they got the contract was they built a miniature prototype that would fly. And they convinced it was the Gull Wing that this aircraft has. You can probably maybe see in one version up here. And the Navy was convinced, and the Navy purchased it. So there were the PBM-1 versions, and the original versions, the floats used to retract. But they did away with those. Later they found it was more stable to have struts and just keep them permanent. The training versions did not have the turrets. These had the ball turrets with 250 calibers. They came with the PBM 3D model. The models that were used in Banana River were the PBM 3S models, which were stripped of these. This model has the radome on it, which the PBM 3D had, which is one we used in the Pacific. But for training, we used, as I said, the 3S. The training in Banana River was crew coordination training. The crew of the plane was 3 pilots, a pilot in command, and 2 co-pilots, and 5 enlisted persons. The enlisted personnel were usually in the positions of the crew chief, generally a mechanic, usually a senior grade, and there was a radioman, a radar operator.
And where would these folks be?
Well, the way the cockpit's here. In back of the cockpit, there is a station in here, which is the nav station, the radar station, and the radio stations all right back up here, and then there were sleeping quarters here. Because the flights were very extended, fuel tanks were in here, and there was space back here. We had ordnance men on the airplane that handled the munitions.
Could the plane drop depth charges?
Yeah, we were equipped to do depth charges, torpedoes, and bombs.
And where were
they were all hung under the wing.
Oh, they were hung under the wing.
Yeah, they were under the wing. They had racks.
I see.
And if you can believe it, we were doing torpedo runs. there's a story about that too. But, you know, at 150 knots, if you can't hit this thing, particularly a man of war, there you got to send them back to gunnery school.
Yeah.
But the airplane was...
how many engines is this?
It had twin engines. The earlier models had the Wright Cyclone engine, 2600. We call it the Wright Novelty Company because we had so many oil leaks and engine failures with that engine. And it had the Curtiss electric props, which made it worse because electric props have a tendency to run away. And there were all kinds of problems with that combination. And they were on the 3D models. Later on, the PBM came out at the end of the war with the PBM-5 model, where they changed the engines to the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, which is a very reliable engine, and we had the Hamilton standard hydraulic props on there. So that combination ridded us of a lot of headache that we had in the Pacific with these airplanes. It was the PBM was a very stable aircraft. It didn't have the hull strength wasn't as good as the PBY. The PBY could take a lot more rough water and
size-wise, how were they?
A lot bigger. This is
the PBM's bigger.
PBM was gross takeoff was around in the 58 close to 60,000 pounds. The PBY I can't quite remember, but I think it was in the 30s somewhere. And the PBM. Would you want me to discuss flying the airplane at this time?
Yes, I think it'd be good.
Well, seaplane operations, again, is quite different than land plane operations. Obviously, you're not on land. You have no brakes. The later models of seaplanes, the P5Ms, had types of speed brakes that they could control.
Yeah.
However, these planes on water, you sail them. They're just about like a sailboat, a big sailboat.
Oh,
because you've got all the tails up, you know, all this wind, the wind affects you very much. Parking them they were parked two ways. When you're in the bay, you had a buoy. The buoy was anchored, and from the hatch, forward hatch, one of the crew members, usually the ordnanceman or bowman, would, as we came alongside, would secure the ship, or the boat, to the buoy with the line. And of course, making a buoy in itself was a thrill, but not so much when you're in training, but during wartime, there's some experiences in here at night trying to make buoys with no lights in a ship. When you have a harbor full of ships, it's pretty difficult.
So, okay, making a buoy, okay,
What you actually do is you locate yourself into the wind.
Okay.
You get, so the wind, you're going into the wind towards the buoy.
Okay, I got you.
And the problem is slowing down the craft when there's no wind, because these big engines windmill, and this thing is moving. And you know, at any kind of reasonable rate of speed, the Batman's only got a little window to catch that buoy as we go by.
Now, how does he catch the
Well,
buoy? Where is
we get right next to the buoy, we taxi right next to the buoy.
Right.
And then he sticks himself out the
There's
hatch. There's a hatch.
Oh, there's a hatch.
There's a hatch there, and he comes out of the hatch, and he leans down and shows a line on it. And so that's one way that you do it. The other problem is, there's one thing if it's out in the open bay, it's another thing when you're going to make a buoy to be used for beaching the aircraft. Now, we used to beach the seaplanes. To beach the plane,
take them up out of the water.
well, yeah, but they used to tow them out. What they have to do is, there's a buoy just outside the beaching area, the beach itself. And you have to make that buoy, tie it up to the buoy. There's no problem if the wind's coming off the water, off the land, you're going into the wind. But when the wind's coming the other way, and you got to come back, if the wind's coming this way, you got to get back in here. You got to maneuver the airplane between the beach and the buoy, and sail that big thing with no control except using your rudders and blipping the engines and changing the engines. Became quite a.
How far under the water does it? How?
You mean how much draft would it have?
Yeah.
Well, it would always be the hatch would always be above the water line here. about,
3 or 4 feet.
yeah, up in here, something like this, when it's sitting, depending upon the weight, how heavy it is. Now, once you tied to the buoy by the beach, then the beaching crew came out and put on beaching gear. There were 2 big wheels, and they installed those on there, and then they would have a track and they'd pull it on up on shore, and then they'd work on it. So that was sort of the beaching and tying.
Okay, so it didn't have any wheels on
No,
it then?
well, no. They later at the end, towards the end of the war, they created an amphib,
Did it?
and it had wheels that retracted, and you could land it on land. But that was really didn't come about until the late, probably in '45. They had the PBYs had them. They called them amphibians.
Yeah.
So that was so much for the beaching and buoy making. Now, as far as operation of the seaplane, a lot depended upon the state of the water, the sea. If we cover the takeoff, for instance, on the takeoff, the wind force, you can tell by the size of the waves. The higher the wave, the higher the wind force. And the waves always break back this way to the wind. The wind is discussing that and they come back. So when you take it off into the wind. There's not with a sort of 8 to 10 knot wind, it's no problem, because the way the plane operates is it's sitting in the water, and when you apply the power to it, first thing it does is it kind of noses up, and then slowly as it gains speed, it raises up on the step onto this thing, and when it gets on the step, it's in the flying attitude. And then, as you reach flight speed, airspeed, you rotate the yoke back, and the plane flies off the water. Now, that's in a normal condition, that's no problem. When I say sea condition, there are other conditions of the sea. When you have very, very smooth water, and you have a heavy aircraft, and this is what happens in the Pacific when we transpact, and there was a small island, Windy, that was the last destination before the Philippines, they put on the armor plate. So that made the airplane very heavy. And when the airplane is very heavy and with fuel, and you've got, what happens, the slick water creates a surface tension. And to break that tension, otherwise this thing's riding on the step, but it doesn't want to fly. So the maneuver is to porpoise the airplane to break the tension, and that gets to be another thrill. Because what you're doing is you're rotating the yoke back and forth, and this thing is going like this, and you catch it on the right hump, and when it gets up in the air with the nose, you yank back on the yoke when you got fly speed, and this thing takes off. And the maximum takeoff for the engine is 5 minutes. They were limited to 5 minute max time. You just couldn't run them forever, otherwise they'd blow up or they overheat. So we had times in the Pacific where we had to make several runs. You just run out of time. You can't get it to work. You can't get it to fly. So that, when the water is slick, that's one condition. Now you've had the normal one. When the water is very rough, of course, that's the other condition where when you take off, you get this big slapping up against the hull as you hit these big waves, and you try to get it up on a step as soon as you can to where it's riding the tops of the waves and you go up. So those are basically the 3 takeoff issues with the seaplane and PBM. The landing is another issue. It also depends on the water condition. When the water is normal, then your landing is relatively normal. You come in at your approach speed and you touch down, and you feel the hull, and you see it, and you just ride it till it runs out of speed, and you just powers back. It just sits in the water, then you taxi. That's no problem. When the water's slick again, you make a power landing, because it's very difficult to tell your relative height above the water with slick water. It's shiny, you can't tell. So what you do is you fly the airplane onto the water, very similar to a land plane power landing in big. We did this most of the time in large multi-engine planes. You fly them onto the runway, fly this onto the water. You just set it up, and it flies till it touches down, and then you pull the power back, so that it's not a question of stalling. The other condition is when the water is very rough. Now, when the water is very rough, you make a semi or full stall landing. If it's real rough, you make a full stall. I mean, when it's really got big waves, because if you hit those waves, you can bust that hull in. So that comes the other thrill, is trying to figure out how to stall it. Because it's a big, heavy thing, and you get the power back. Because I can tell you, you drop 2 feet in that thing, and your stomach falls out from under you. You feel like you never know you're going to sink. And we had some good experiences with that too. But that's the trick. You have to full stall it. When it's real rough, you just get it to where it just drops out from under you, and it hits the water, and then it stops. See? So that way you don't have a big water run against the big waves. So you're trying to get it full stall, and then or partial stall. The biggest thrill of all is a night landing with no lights. The night landing with no lights in a bay full of ships with no sea lane marked is a nice thrill. We had lots of those. Because that's the power landing. Once you locate the landing area and see that it's clear, because you get, otherwise if you have a little moon, it's okay. Because with moon, you're trying to get down moon, you can kind of get a picture of where the landing area is. Because we operate out of a lot of bays, Mangler Bay, Lingayen Bay, and they were full of ships. And planes, because we had planes tied up down there too. So when landing it, the power landing, you get down moon so you can see whatever it is, if there's any moon, and you just fly the thing right down to zero. And the biggest thrill is when you're sitting there, because you set it up to land, you just put it in approach attitude, and you get your power set up properly, and it's got your flaps set up, you just sit there, and you just sit there, and you sit there, and you sit there, and you sit there. Pretty soon, all the time it's already zero, and you still don't feel it touch the water. And you wonder where you are. And finally, you feel it touch the water, and then you do everything by direction, because all the instruments all at night. So you use the instruments in the airplane, you fly the heading, and you keep the direction. And of course, if the sea is rough, it's rough. It means nothing you can do about it. You're not going to make a full stall landing there, because there's no way you can do that. So then you have to make the buoy. You got the same thing at night, trying to find one of those buoys. So it was the seaplane operation, and then there's one other landing, and that is open sea. Now, if you have to pick up rescue people that are in boats, how do you make an open sea landing? Well, again, it depends upon the sea state. If the sea state is in one of the conditions we're talking about, there's not a problem, but a lot of times the sea state, you get the swells, as you know. And the swells make a big difference. They flop you right up in the air if they're big swells. So the trick is to land between the swells and try to keep the airplane in the trough when you land. So you land it in the trough. Not even unless there's a dominant wind that makes it so important that you try to get it into the wind. Usually there isn't, because that's why the swells are there. It's pretty calm. Then you just land in the swell and taxi around and pick up where you have to go. So that basically is the.
How long could you taxi if you had to?
Well, I can tell you, we lost several times. We lost engines. And when I say lose the engine, I don't lose the engine. It just quits. I mean, it catches on fire. We had engine fires. One particular time, I was fortunate. We were fortunate in my crew. I was flying with in our squadron. Well, let me go ahead to this Boeing squadron, and then we'll talk about that.
Okay.
So so that was operating the PBM. We learned the crew coordination, everything at Banana River, and then from Banana River you went to your squadron. There were a number of PBM squadrons operating all over, I guess, the Pacific, Atlantic. A lot of people don't realize that the PBMs did a great job in the Atlantic, Caribbean, sunk submarines, did a lot of search, rescue. So they were very, very used, Alaska. So the PBMs were all over, but I was most familiar, obviously, with the Pacific operation. Now, there were a number of PBM squadrons in the 20s, BP 20, BP 21, 22, 23, we were VP-25. We formed at Harvey Point, North Carolina, which is on the Albemarle Sound area, in that area.
So you went from Pensacola to
No, from Banana River.
Banana River, I mean.
Yeah, to Harvey Point.
Okay.
That was
where is that?
in North Carolina.
I know, but where in North Carolina?
It's on the coast, must be up the northern area near Virginia, because it's somewhere on the Sound,
Okay.
in that area, general area there.
Up above Jacksonville.
I think it's up in that, yeah. And
Yeah,
it was a naval base where they trained PBM crews. And my squadron was VPB-25. We formed about May of '44. The commanding officer's name was, he was a Lieutenant Commander J.C. Scores. And the XO's name was, he was an ex-chief aviation pilot, probably one of the best qualified BBM pilots in the world, because he had tested the planes with Martin. So he was the XO. His name was, he was Lieutenant Frank Screws. So we were scored and screwed, what we said. That was the motto of our squadron. But they were great people, and I ended up flying with Lieutenant Screws, and he was a real tough tester. He was a great pilot, but he ran a taut ship. He was, Navy. He had a lot of training, and so he. And our plane was called Twin Screws, and so we ended up, for some reason or other, in his crew. And he chewed tobacco. He was from Georgia, and he did a lot of good flying. So he was a good patrol plane commander to fly with. So, in any event, the work at Harvey Point was to form the squadron, to shake it down, airplanes, and do the maneuvers and training at night.
How many planes in a squadron?
We had about 15. And to just do all the training that we would be doing basically for war, all the type of runs and landings, takeoffs, buoys, and et cetera. And so we completed our training there and proceeded to go to the West Coast. And these were all cross-country transcontinental flights. And of course, in a seaplane, you got to land at seaplane bases. So we would land at Eagle Mountain Lake in Fort Worth, and then we go to. In fact, I landed in the Salton Sea out here. They had a base out there. Yeah, they had a base in Salton Sea, and then we go to San Diego or NAS Alameda. We had some planes that had trouble. There was one plane landed in Dry Lake, not one of ours, but landed he had engine failure and landed in the Dry Lake. So we transcontinental with the airplanes. And of course, in the crew, the co-pilots were all navigators. We didn't have special navigators like the Air Force. So we navigated, we alternated flying and navigating. When we got to the West Coast, we spent very little time, and then came the Trans-Pac out to Hawaii. So that flight was from Alameda, and it was 16, almost 17 hours en route, almost all at night. And that was where I really learned that I needed to know something about celestial navigation. Because I've got a whole section that I'll discuss later about navigation itself, covering different navigation, celestial, etc. But celestial was very special and was very necessary. As you know, as far as navigation is pilotage. Pilotage is where you're flying point to point, recognize landmarks. That's what's done in VFR and done mostly by light airplanes. Then the other one is what they call dead reckoning. Dead reckoning navigation is where you use these little circular devices. They call them E6Bs, is what those give you a name for it. And with that, you could determine by applying your wind direction and velocity, you can work out your true heading, your true course, your ground speed, and then convert your time and distance to a line on the chart. That's called dead reckoning. It's not very good for fixing, but if that's all you got. Then when you get into celestial navigation, which was the next form that we used, you also use the drift sight for dead reckoning. There was an aperture in the bottom of the aircraft where you could look at the water of the ground, and by taking the drift over the ground, you could, and your speed and your heading and so forth, you could compute what the wind velocity direction is. And that could be applied to whatever your course is, and you get some sort of drift. Then with the celestial, you use the planets, the sun, moon, you use the stars. And of course, to be able to use these for celestial navigation, you have to be able to identify them. Well, we all know what the moon and the sun looks like, but the stars and the first magnitude stars, which are used for celestial navigation, are all in constellations. So you learn the stars by the constellations. And there was a device called the Rude Star Finder, which I think I left one with you. I had one that round circular device with that's the plotting board. Now, the Rude Star Finder is a little one in a black case, if you stand it there. Yeah, this is the Rude Star Finder here. It was a device, I'll just hold it up here, you can see it.
Yeah.
It's a device with a lot of plates on it, like this. These are plates, and they fit on another base plate. And with this, you're supposed to be able to identify constellations in the sky. Well, that's all well and good if you got a lot of time, but usually in navigation, you don't have the time to fiddle around, but you got to know it beforehand. This is okay as a study device, but not practical in the airplane. So on that trip to Honolulu, that's 16 hours at night, and I was doing a lot of the navigating because it so happened that my regular co-pilot was ill. He didn't make the trip. He had another one on there, and he had very little navigation experience. So I found out very quickly that flying in and out of clouds and looking up and all of a sudden you see a piece of something, and you got to really know what you're doing to find it. So I decided when I got to Honolulu, I was going to learn, or Hawaii, I was going to learn what was up there. So I spent a lot of time at night at the sky identifying the constellations and the stars in the constellations, so that if I saw a little piece of it, and when you know beforehand what the sky looks like, generally, then you can identify it. You know it. Now, the only problem is that in the southern hemisphere, everything is different. And we were flying a lot in the southern hemisphere. But so I had to learn that too. But anyhow, the way the celestial works is you have a sextant, and when you shoot the star, you get an altitude of the star, and you take a time. The U.S. Hydrographic Office produced books, tables, and in these tables you could look up under that star, that time, and that angle, and it gave you a line of position. So if you had 3 stars that set up a line of position, you got to fix. And that's basically how the celestial worked. And we used to shoot the stars, as they call it, from the cockpit. And the co-pilot would shoot and relay the information to the guy that's doing navigation, the other one, and he would do the plotting, and we used big charts, and we plotted them. So that was the celestial part, and that came in handy because when I first went to work with FAA on Pan Am, they were still using navigators. So I was, that was in the early 60s, they still had navigators on their airplanes. But they had a hole up at the top of the sextant, and they used a different sextant, but it's still the same, computation and everything was the same. So then, of course, the next form of navigation that came in was Loran. And there was limited Loran stations, and Loran was it's a long-range radio navigation system. And you had probably 10 different operations before you finally got down to the blip that you needed. But it worked, if and you had the charts. And I think I left you some Loran charts too from the 44. And then there was radar navigation, using mapping the the area. So basically those were the, and there was the NDBs, the beacons, radio beacons.
Was the radar pretty reliable?
We had big radar then, and it was, I'd say reasonably reliable at that time. We, mostly a lot of it had to do with experience of the operator, because picked up, you know, we were flying over water a lot, but we'd get blips. Some of them were islands, some of them were whatever, they were ships sometimes. And we mapped, one night we went in and mapped Formosa Harbor. We had to go in very low and radar map it for ships and things for send out for intelligence. But so basically that was the navigation that was done. We did all forms of it in the PBM. So the squadron, as I said, was a long night flight to Hawaii. In Hawaii, we again did some training. We had to leave our suitcases. The Navy issued the aviators these green bags. We had a suit bag and we had a little handbag. But we had to live aboard ships, and aboard the seaplane tent there's no room. So what they do is they make you a sea chest out of wood, and you put all your gear in the sea chest, and then when you got aboard ship, you throw it away, throw the box away. So all you had was your clothes. And we didn't have a lot of clothes either. But the green bags were left in the BOQ downstairs. And one of the sad experiences I had was when I came back through Kaneohe into the BOQ. I went down to get my suitcase. I looked around. I saw these bags of my friends that didn't come back. So it was a little bit, you know, a little sad there. But anyhow, so we were in Hawaii. We were at Kaneohe. It was a base, and they were based there. We trained out of Kaneohe. Then after our training was completed, we had to transpack out to the Philippines. The transpack to the Philippines was done through island hopping. Johnson Island was one of the islands. Then you went to Johnson.
Let's stop here for a second. I want to put a map up,
Okay.
and maybe we can.
Am I blocking?
No, you're fine.
Okay, the transpack from Honolulu, or should I say from Kaneohe, on the island of Oahu. First stop is in the Johnson Islands, which is right here.
Here's Honolulu here.
Why don't I just say it, you can point it out.
Yeah.
It'll be easier.
Okay,
First stop was from Hawaii, Kaneohe to Johnson Island.
Okay.
And then from Johnson, I think it was to Kwajalein, which is right here.
Down there, right.
It's Kwajalein.
Down to Kwajalein.
And then the next stop was Manus Island. Manus is in either Guinea or is Manus. Manus is this truck.
Might not be
Wow,
down there.
Manus. Yeah, let's see. Manus was, then Manus, and then Windy was a small island. I don't think Windy's going to be on there. Windy's very small. It's in this, let's see, the Philippines. So the route was in here, towards the Philippines. And then we landed in Leyte, in Tacloban Bay and Leyte.
Lady.
Yeah.
Good.
Then the fun started. Well, we landed, well, I mentioned the problems with takeoff on slick water with armor plate. We had that problem at Windy Island because that was our stop for Philippines where they put on the armor plate. Then when we landed in Tacloban and Leyte, we landed right in the middle of an air raid. Japanese were bombing the place.
Yeah.
So we had to land. We didn't have a place to go. So we landed, and there were other planes on the water. And the procedure when you land is to refuel right after you land. But of course we waited on the refueling because no one wanted to refuel in the middle of an air raid. So when the air raid was over, you refuel from the rear of the tender. There's a seaplane tender there, and from the rear of the tender you would refuel. So we taxied up to the rear of the tender, and my co-pilot and I, and the plane commander gets off the plane. He's going in to debrief. I said, "Where are you going?" He says, "Going to have a debrief." It's already getting dark. Looks, it was a mess after that. Anyhow, we got tied up, and that was, we got aboard ship. And then he sent out, the way they do it, they sent out a personnel boat. and the personnel boat takes a crew, and we used to man all of our planes. We never left the plane empty without a crew member. And one crew member stayed on the plane. The British never did this on their seaplanes, but we did it because the concept was that in case they had to, they could turn the plane up. Because sometimes when the water they got a lot of wind or typhoon or something, it would blow away from the anchor. And the only way you could keep it there was to turn the engines up into the wind and hold the plane still. So that was the concept anyhow. So we went aboard tender, but unfortunately the crew that we were supposed to relieve hadn't left yet. And the seaplane tenders, we were aboard about 5 different ones. This one happened to be the San Pablo, the Orca, the Half Moon. There were a number of these small seaplane tenders. And the bunks were 3 in a row for the officers out. The enlisted men, I think, were sleeping in hammocks. And they were all so close together that you had to get out to turn over to get back in. But there were no bunks. So they said, okay, take a mattress and find a place to sleep. I hadn't never been on a ship before. I didn't know anything about them. So I said, well, it's hot, so I go up on deck. So I get this mattress and sling it on my shoulder. I get up on deck and I'm laying there sleeping. And all of a sudden, wham! I hear this big noise and the damn gun went off. I was parked next to a 5-inch gun. There was an air raid going on. The air raid started. And I was flabbergasted. I didn't know what it was. And it was dark. And so finally, the captain comes along. I didn't know it was the captain, but somebody stepped on me. I was sleeping. And he says, I looked up and here's this guy with 3 stripes on his arm. And he said, what are you doing down there, son? I said, well, sir, there's no place to sleep. There's cruise today. He says, come on, I'll find you a place. So he took me up topside, and the captain has a special bunk room right next to the quarterdeck so he can sleep when he has to there. So he just stayed here for a while. So I had a great bunk. I'll think to myself. And finally, after about 2 days, PPC Screw said to me, I haven't seen where you're sleeping, Dave. And I said, oh, I'm fine. He said, where are you sleeping? And he said, I looked all over the ship. I can't find you. So I said, I'll show you. I took him up on deck. He says, you get out of here. He says, you're out of here. So he threw me out of that place and got me someplace to sleep down there. But anyhow, it was kind of a fun experience. But so we were stationed aboard the tender, and we were flying missions out of Lady. And then I remember that either the next day or another day later, I noticed these P-38s coming back from missions. And I'd see these guys slow rolling over the airport. And I saw one guy, one engine came in, he was slow rolling. So I said, what are you doing that for? He says, well, when they shoot down a plane, they always come in and slow roll. If they do 2 slow rolls, they shut down 2 planes. So, another vignette. But
now, this was 1944?
yeah, this was November. The Battle of Lady had just was winding down. There was the battle that we were involved in later was the Battle of San Bernardino Straits, which came about later, about the beginning of the year. And we had an interesting situation with that one because I think our plane commander was determined to get some medals. So he used to volunteer for everything. So he volunteered for this flight, and he says, you guys ought to come, but I'll tell you what it is. He says, we have 2 planes from the squadron that are going, and we're going to put torpedoes on them, and we're going up against the Japanese fleet. You don't have to come if you don't want to. So who's going to say no? So, yeah, all right. So we get out there, and they hadn't loaded too many torpedoes, so it took them a while to get it loaded. And the other plane had gotten loaded up, and he was taxiing in circles waiting. So we're loaded, and finally we start the engines, and we can't get the starboard engine started.
Now the torpedo is
big,
I know what it is, but it hangs from the wing.
Hangs right under the wing. Yeah, it hangs right under the wing.
Hangs right under the wing.
Yeah, I have a picture in this book showing them installing them. There's one in
really?
there.
Yeah.
Shows them installing them under the wings.
Huh.
And of course we had drops and everything else. We made runs, but we never thought we'd have to do it because we didn't. That'd be pretty desperate. They threw everything they had at the Japanese fleet. So we couldn't get the starboard engine. Another case where one of our planes, our basic mission of our airplanes was we flooded the China coast was about 10 hours from there. We'd go,
Let's take a look.
yeah, we would
there
go,
again.
I'll show you.
Yeah.
We operated in this area from the lady operation was we were flying down through Borneo in here, down around the equator in this area in here, Brunei Bay, that area, and then up through here, the China coast, the French Indochina coast, Hainan, and about this kind of a circle. That's about the work we did, and it was anti-sub patrol, search for ships, and we did some search and rescue where necessary. A lot of it had to do working with destroyers for subs.
How long would the mission usually
Well,
take?
most of our flights would average from 10 to 12 hours. We'd go out, we'd take off usually about 4:30 at night, in the afternoon or the evening, and we would fly all night. And we had, of course, we had a small galley on the airplane, and unfortunately, the only thing we had to drink was the grapefruit juice, which tastes like battery acid about 3 o'clock in the morning. But considering all things being considered, that setup was bad. They were just long night flights, and we flew very low. We flew mostly on all the radar. We were flying about 500 feet above the water. They were similar to what they call the black cat missions that PBYs used to fly. They call them black cats, but they can't do that. We flew, I don't know, at least probably 2 or 3 missions a week. Then when we come back, they'd send out a beer. You couldn't drink on ship, so they sent out a case of beer or something, and the guy sit on the wing. Nobody on our crew drank. I had a bunch of, most of it, just a few of us. The officers were when they were drank a couple of cans of beer, and you're already drunk. You have to get up all night. But those were the missions, and I guess probably some of the things that I remember there were that one particular flight operation. Then we had another operation where one of our crews had contaminated fuel, and both engines were quitting, and he landed in a small reef called Bombay Reef, which was located off the China coast up in this area in here. And anyhow, he landed inside the reef. It was a coral atoll, and he landed in it, and he had sent a message, and we were there going to go to refuel the airplane. So again, Commander Screws, he'd made lieutenant commander by then. He volunteered, and he worked out a system to where we would carry enough fuel to land, and after they would purge the tanks, their fuel tanks on the water, and we would land, break out a dinghy with a hose, and roll over to the other ship, and then we would fuel him from our ship. So there were 2 or 3 things involved. One, we had to find a place. They didn't have any nav aids, except navigation. It was a daylight flight, so the only thing you have is the sun, if you're lucky, and drift sight, and DR, and radar when you get close enough to the island, assuming you ever get within range of the island. So that was another thrill trying to find a place, but we did. And so we landed, and the other thing about landing and taking off in an atoll is it's full with coral heads. They're all sticking up. You can't see some of them buried right beneath the water. So all they do is just rip the hull out, and then you're part of the fish. So the landing part is the easiest part, because you can see ahead of you till you land. But when you take off, you can't see nothing because that big nose is out in front of your elbow. And he saved the crew, otherwise I don't know how they'd have to get them out there somewhere or the other. That was one of the things. Then we did some, we had one occasion where we were attacked. Yeah. This happened off Brunei Bay down here in Borneo, the Borneo area. Yeah. It was dark about night, and we went as a